guys, we're Gŵyl Haf. Welcome to Gŵyl Haf and to this wonderful afternoon here at the festival. Today with me, I am absolutely thrilled to have Sarah Ardizzone, and who's talking today specifically. She's a French to English translator and has done many works, but today we're going to focus in on someone you might have encountered on your French A-level syllabus if you have been so lucky as to study it. Faïza Guène. Faïza Guène. And yeah, so we're going to talk. So her book, the most famous one that you might have come across, is Just Like Tomorrow. That's in the English translation. And we're going to have a little talk about her work and in particular her use of slang overall. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining me.
Oh, thank you, Caitlin. It's lovely being here today.
Not at all. I can't express my gratitude for you taking the time out of your day to do this. So let's get straight stuck in. So I know that you had a little bit of an interesting walk up to Faiza's books, and it came about sort of through a series of, if not, you were living in Marseille and then you were representing some musicians, there was some children's books. How did that flow into, how did you first come across Faiza?
Yeah, so there's this thing called the CNL, which is the National Book Centre in France. And when you're working as a professional literary translator, you are eligible to have a grant to spend time in France or a French-speaking country for up to 3 months every 3 years. So I came up for one of those grants, and I was working on a children's series for Walker Books called Golem that was actually written by 3 siblings, and it was a reimagining of the sort of Golem myth, the Jewish legend, kind of transposed into 21st century, very diverse urban setting. So I thought, great, if I've got 3 months in a French speaking context, I'm going to go down to Marseille, which I didn't know at all, and mix it up down there and meet new people and sort of discover new voices and find out how those might influence and impact on the way I translate. And the influence and impact was way bigger than I would ever have imagined. And as you say, actually, the first people I met were musicians, and Marseille is this extraordinary kind of locus in the world where it's the southern Mediterranean and it's the beginning of Africa, and you've got a big North African community, but you've also got Corsica, Sardinia, Italy, Spain represented there, and the Caribbean. So these were some of the people that I was rubbing up against and being inspired by, and ultimately was involved in bringing a group over to the London African Music Festival. And that group was called Les Orientales, and it was reviving Algerian music hall music from the 40s and 50s. And that music as well was all about mixing it up, because in Algeria, you'd had the influence of American GIs, Puerto Rican GIs. And so there was the popular music, Chabi music of the Casbah that was traditionally sung by men. But there was also Mamba and Cha-Cha-Cha and French chanson and Spanish ballads, all that in the mix. And what was very different about this project was that women were singing the lead parts. So it was kind of reimagined for a 21st century audience. It was at the time, I think, of 50 years since Algerian independence. It had a massive traditional orchestra, what gets called an Oriental or a Middle Eastern orchestra that goes with it. And it was under the godparentship of 2 greats, Lili Boniche and Maurice El Medioni, who were Jewish Algerian musicians. And in all of that, I was busy figuring how the different kinds of texture and language I was hearing and working with might find their way into this series of children's books I was translating. And when I came back to the UK, I was so fascinated by this process of how you capture language from the street and how you put that on a page in a way that's not patronizing, in a way that is going to kind of be robust against the problem of obsolescence and sell-by dates like grotty yogurts. You know, what are you going to do if someone looks at this a year or so down the line? And I live in Brixton, which, as you may know, is a very diverse area of South London. And so I teamed up with a youth organization there called Live. And at the time, they were running an amazing magazine called Live Magazine. And that was by and for young peeps, 12 to 21-year-olds. And what was very striking about the young people involved in that is just how many languages they spoke and how rangy their backgrounds were. And in there, Faïza and I, when Faïza eventually came into the mix of this, as it were, was gold dust in the form of Cleo Soazandri, who'd grown up in the suburbs of Paris from Madagascan and Ghanaian backgrounds, and then come to Stockwell and Brixton. And so she was bicultural, bilingual, but the thing that was really unique was that she could navigate between different types of slang in different languages. And so I just hung out with those young people and talked about their rolling slang dictionary and how they kept updating and evolving it, and how their understanding of register worked. And it was very clear to me just how sharp and smart they were about when they wanted to use stuff, when it was appropriate, when it gave them an edge to use it, when it gave them an edge to be silent about it. So all those kind of code cracking skills that make for a linguist and make for a writer, make for someone who's really, really adept at navigating slang. And I hooked up as well with Jonathan Green, who writes Green's Dictionary of Slang and who Martin Amis has called the King of Slang. And so he was giving me the kind of Oxford English Dictionary citation going back in time in all of this. And I ended up writing a piece for The Guardian about those young people at Live Magazine and about the journey they were on with their rolling slang dictionary, and about how that gave them voice, but don't trap them in that voice. There's a lot of different ways that we can all speak in, and the power lies in the ability to switch and move and decide what's appropriate in a context. And that article led to me being approached by Michael Rosen's program, Word of Mouth. So I read a radio package where I got to record the young people. And so by that time, Golem was out in the world and published. And I'd made a tiny bit of noise, I guess you could say, about thinking about how we translate and thinking where slang fits into all of this. And so when Penguin Random House, as it now is, acquired Faïza Guène, they came to me and said, you seem to have been doing work in this area. Is this something that you would be interested in? And so Faïza came into my life and absolutely changed my life. And I still remember reading, I had a printout of the uncorrected proofs of What Is Just Like Tomorrow in English and Kiffe, Demain in French. And it was literally one of those cases where I went to the end of the bus line. I completely forgot where I was and what was happening. And then I had to work out how to get back to where I actually needed to go to. And I was talking with Faïza for a podcast that we're recording with Trafficker Europe recently, and we were reflecting on the fact that when I first met her in person, and I'd done my first draft of Kiffe Demain by then, she was 19 and I was 35. And here we are now, 16 years later. So she is exactly the age that I was when I first met her. And I remember those were in the days still I used mini disc to record sound, and I recorded that whole interview. And we just had so much to talk about, because as a translator, you're the shrink of the text, in the sense that you've constantly got to analyze motivations as well as finding all sorts of creative linguistic solutions. And so I was writing an article about her for The Guardian. That was why I was interviewing her. But because I translated the book and because we had this depth of knowledge between us, the interview just rolled and rolled for hours, and she couldn't believe the questions that I was probing. And it felt like a really deep conversation and a real meeting in terms of humor and curiosity about language, and a commitment to voices that aren't normally captured on the page, whether that's linguistically, whether that's because of demographics and geographical kind of off the radar spots. so yeah, that was the beginning of the journey that we went on, and here we are. Men Don't Cry comes out with Cassava Republic this summer, which I'm incredibly excited about. And we're just signing off on covers at the moment. And then next year, Discretion, Faïza's 6th novel, will be published. And I'm got the privilege of translating that for Saki Books. So it's been a long and an ever evolving journey with Faïza.
Absolutely. So that journey that starts with Faïza when she's 19 and with Just Like Tomorrow, and then ends with, well, currently is up to Discretion. What, for people who maybe aren't familiar with Faïza's work, what is it that is particularly distinctive and particularly important that she's doing, and how has she changed? Because I think it's quite interesting. I think her writing gets tighter. I think it, you know, there's definitely a sort of, you know, like I can see a change in sort of some writing styles, but actually I think it's remarkable for how little it's changed from what I've read, from sort of Just Like Tomorrow and Dreams from the Ends and Men Don't Cry, and so that voice is still very much the same. And then I was wondering how you feel that you've changed as a translator from Just Like Tomorrow to Discretion as well.
So there's a really simple answer to that, which is that I'm 16 years older, and that makes a big fat difference. And the same for Faïza. And so inevitably, you know, when she was starting out, Just Like Tomorrow was published when she was 19, but she'd been writing that from when she was 15, 16. So it was absolutely capturing the teenage voices, particularly from around her. And that's something that, you know, with time you move on from. You're not going to get stuck in a time warp there. And the last thing you want to be is a geriatric in the wrong place. So that shifts. Something that Faïza was talking about recently is she's often asked who her literary influences have been. And of course, she can cite the writers who've really had an impact on her, especially as a young person. But I think she feels increasingly empowered to say that the real influences on her are the oral storytellers that she grew up with, particularly her aunts, who she would go and visit back in Algeria in the summer holidays. And that sort of power of storytelling, and it being a very democratic space, it being very funny, it being obliged to capture your attention because you can see instantly if you're not getting the reaction that you want. I think that's had the biggest impact on her. And I think what has stayed the same with her is the political commitment to getting people who are too often invisible in the mainstream visible, and getting their street names visible, and getting the names of the stadiums where they live visible, and kind of creating a roadmap for something to have a place. And so I think Men Don't Cry was an incredibly important novel and turning point for her. It was a very eventful moment in her life. She lost her father before the end of that book, and she knew that was heading that way. She lost her editor, and the book is dedicated to her editor, and she was pregnant with her daughter. So it was a time of massive loss and massive new life at the same time, and of life being bigger than what she could contain in some ways in a novel right then. So I think that was the point, that life just got huge for her. And I think she had a lighter novel, Millennium Blues, which followed that, which was this sort of a brief golden moment in diversity relations in France, we might say. And then, of course, we had the horror of the terrorist attacks in the Bataclan, and the horrific pressure that placed particularly Algerian Muslim communities under in France, that people were being asked to actively step away from one community, to decry it, to show very, very evident support of the victims of the situation. And of course that support was there. But I think that the way that demand of a sort of public show of patriotism was expressed was very contentious and difficult to handle. And I think that Discretion, which is Faïza's latest book and which I'm currently translating, there is a real journey there. So it's the first novel that Faïza has written in the third person. The others are first person. And Bar Balto is a series of first persons. It's a series of characters in a whodunit. So it's moved to the third person, and it is primarily about a fictionalized version of Faïza's mother and women like her. So the mother's called Yamina. And again, this theme of invisibility, these women who came to France to join their husbands who were working here from Algeria, and who did everything they could to keep their head down, to give their kids a head start, and to not pass on their hardship and their trauma. And so in addition to being invisible in society, in some ways they were self-censoring and self-muting because there was this anxiety about passing on something that might be damaging, that might not enable the children, the next generation, to fly. And I think what Faïza brilliantly takes apart in Discretion is, firstly, the fact that if you keep quiet about something, it will erupt, it will blow up in your face at some point, and that trauma will be transmitted, is the sort of literal translation from French, but it will be handed down, it will be passed on, it will be a legacy that you can't escape. So there comes a point where we have to talk about it. And Discretion is dedicated in part to the father. It says to Faïza's father, who died of discretion, who died of keeping quiet, which is incredibly poignant and powerful and upsetting. And an example of that would be that in October 1961, there was a notorious incident where there was a peaceful demonstration by Algerian communities in and around Paris, because this was a time where Algeria still wasn't independent. And what happened was that there were police instructions to fire essentially on the crowd. And a lot of bodies ended up being thrown by the police into the Seine River that night. And it's something that Macron has commissioned a kind of official work, interrogation, history into French Algerian relations from a very critical and no holds barred perspective. And I believe that's due out later this year. And that incident is a very big incident in it. And Faïza's father was there that night, and he witnessed what happened as a very young man. And it was something that he didn't talk to Faïza about. And Faïza, as a young novelist, was also a young filmmaker, and she made a short documentary about it, and she interviewed various people, and she was supported in that by a historian who was integral in bringing this story back to light, and bringing particularly somebody called Papon, who had been in the police, to justice for his role as a collaborator in the Second World War, for his role in the Algerian War of Independence, and for his role in that night, Maurice Papon. So Faïza had amazing support in that film, and it was only after that that I think she was able to talk to her father a tiny bit about it. So there is this huge theme of the danger of not talking. And I think the other driver in Discretion is the danger of thinking of things as separate and disconnected. And so in some ways, the novel moves, flits, travels between Technicolor France in 2018, and that's the adult lives of Yamina the mum's grown-up children. So we're following them in Paris from 2018 onwards. But it goes right back to 1949 in Algeria and the birth of the mother character, and what she experiences post-Second World War, what she experiences with the War of Independence, what she experiences as a refugee, and what she experiences when she comes to the UK. And it would be easy to think of these sort of two worlds as splinters, shards, fragments, and how do they connect? How do they fit together? And what I find so moving about Faïza's writing is that she is on this quest to find those connections and to shine a light on these lives and to say, you know, this isn't a French Algerian family. This is a French family. This is the French story. This is all part of the bigger picture of the French story. And until we start having a definition of that French story that is generous enough and porous enough to include everybody in it, and to cease having quite such a normative prescription about what that story might be, we're in trouble. You know, that's where we've got to head. So I think there is a real step change between the earlier books that really capture Faïza's blinding sense of humor, her brilliant ear for dialogue, the fact that she is a script writer as well, that writing characters' voices is in her DNA, you know, going down from those Algerian aunties. That's what she does. And then moving to something that is in a way slightly more philosophical, more political, more adult, and less afraid in its ask. Bolder, I think, in saying, this doesn't want to be ghettoized, this doesn't want to be siloed, this doesn't want to be something apart. This is part of the story that everybody has to hear and that we kind of all move forward together with.
It's really interesting when you first sort of were talking about how it was in third person and then how it also focuses on an older narrative. I was thinking, oh wow, that's so different. You know, that sort of them being first person, present day characters are so that you so identify with. I feel like so much a part of these other books, but actually the more you talk, the more I was like, oh no, I can completely, I feel like this feels like it fits in such a way. And there's such a I think something Faïza does that is something we should celebrate more within sort of the literature community, is it's really, really readable. Her language, it is in those crossroads. We were having a conversation about whether it's YA or literary fiction, and the answer is both should be reading it. And that in that crossroads is a book for many more people, which is a good thing. You know, not to say that books that aren't for many people isn't a good thing, but this is a book that uses language in a very clever and simple way. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about language use in it, or sort of, you know, and then I guess this whole slang conversation can kind of start from there. In particular, within the books, there is this use of lots of Arabic, but you've had to translate a lot of the slang from Algeria, French slang, particularly from communities with a large number of Algerian people as well. And you've translated it somewhat into British slang, and then you also have some core words. Like the word that stands out to me throughout all of them that I've read is bled, and that is just this crucial word. So language and how they exist in these books.
So wow, there's a lot to answer there, Caitlin.
I think that was about 4 questions in one. I'm really sorry.
Let's take it backwards. So this word bled means the home country. So for an Algerian, the bled is the motherland or the fatherland, it's the home country. But in white metropolitan French, bled can just mean a sort of godforsaken place in the middle of nowhere. So it has this range of meanings. And when I started out translating Faïza, bled crops up a lot, because the idea of returning to the home country crops up a lot. And Faïza, it was Faïza who said, look, it's a really simple word. Let's just get everybody on board from the get-go and let's use it. And so there we go. It's unequivocal how you might pronounce it. It's easy to read, and it quickly becomes apparent what it means. And so that's interesting too, because in the early days, I think, of translating Faïza and the sort of publishing scene at the time, back in 2005, there was more of a tendency to use italics, to use asterisks, to explain, to have glossaries. And I think there's much more of an acceptance and an inclusion now, and a feeling that, you know, one of the extraordinary things about the English language is its hybridity. It's been fed by everything forever. And a lot of stuff in terms of grammar and spelling was retrofitted way down the line. So let's not pretend otherwise. And the more at the party, you know, the better. I often think in relation to Faïza, that fantastic sort of adage of diversity is inviting people to the party, and inclusion is welcoming them to dance. And it's that kind of thing with language, that all language fits there, and there doesn't want to be a hierarchy within it. So bled is a simple win that solves that. When I started translating Just Like Tomorrow, I think I did have a real YA headset. I think it is a YA book as much as anything. It's glorious for adult readers, but I think the readers on whom it's made the biggest impact may be young people. And I know in France that's the case. And when I do workshops here, you know, I have literally had young people who came to this country from another culture and another language saying that was the first English book that they read, and that really got them into reading in English. And so I think I was particularly targeting a YA audience, and I think at the time for Faïza and me, it felt fun in a sense to adapt it. So to create, to some extent, a British equivalent. So it becomes Paradise Estate, the estate where Doria is growing up, and the English there is inflected by, you know, multi-urban ethnic English. And so there'll be quite a Jamaican influence there, and quite an Asian influence there, and so on. And I think as time has gone on, I'm much warier of adapting, or what can get called in academic circles domesticating. And I'm much more wanting just the hybridity to exist, and for you to be able to see different things at the same time. So that hologram idea, you know, with a football card, and you hold it at one angle and you see the goal and the ball is outside, and you tilt it and the person's kicked the ball into the goal. And Anthea Bell used to talk, the late great translator, about translation as you sort of want at some level to see both the original and the new destination at the same time. And I think Faïza has so much scope for that. The word I always think about in relation to her use of language is dosage. She's very, very canny with how much and how far she pushes a language trope or an idea. So think of it like a bottle of medicine, literally, you know, a dosage in that sense. So when Kiffe Demain came out, it was very iconoclastic in France because it put on the page verlan. So that is backslang. Okay, so the backslang that's largely of the multi-ethnic suburbs these days, and that's influenced by Arabic and West African languages such as Wolof and Romani. And l'inverse is the word for backwards in French. And if you flip it, you get verlan. You slice it down the middle, and l'inverse becomes verlan. And so the word fou is mad, and that becomes ouf, back to front. And it's kind of about mixing it and seeing how you feel with it. It's not prescriptive, but it's about chopping, moving it around, playing with it, moving it on again. So Arabe is the word for somebody of Arab origins, North African origins. It's already a terminology we wouldn't use so much in the English language. And if you, the first flipping of Arab gives you beurre. So beurre would be the backslang for somebody, for example, of North African heritage. But then you find words like beurre being used in the mainstream papers. So of course it's got to move on again at street level. So it becomes khube. And so the thing keeps on moving. So in a sense, what you need to capture is more the dynamic and more the kind of freshness of something that keeps evolving, and less the specificity of what the Jamaican word in Brixton right now is for X, because that's going to over tie it down. So it's that rhythm, that sound, that color, that orality, that keeping it moving. And sometimes recycling works brilliantly because words come back round. So a word like fool, which is Shakespearean, is also a super insulting word to use of somebody in a playground in the UK today. So that's great, because wherever you're traveling from, you understand that fool is probably not a compliment. So I love it when stuff gets recycled, and the same with oh my days. And I can remember I think there was one review of Just Like Tomorrow, which was really well received and had really exciting and interesting reviews. But one said something like, what is with this oh my days? It sounds like Enid Blyton, and it was Enid Blyton in the sense that it's old terminology, but it comes back round again. So that's some of the dynamic that I'm looking for. She's, in her use of language, it's very sharp, it's very funny, it's very on the nose, it's quite performative and in the moment, and you could hear it being said. And I was thinking when you were talking about crossroads at the beginning of your mega question, Caitlin, and thinking about something like Steve McQueen's Small Axe, and why I think that is such a monumental, exceptional, landscape shifting work of television, is because so many people have come to that from so many different places and wanted to have conversations about it. And I've had conversations with my British Jamaican neighbour here in Brixton, and I've had conversations with people who I would loosely describe as having hefty silver spoons in their mouths when they were born, and everything around that. And everyone's felt that they've had a position and been invited to that party of engaging with that, thinking about, in that case, the British cultural landscape. And I hope Faïza works at some level in that way, that wherever you're traveling from, you are welcome, you will get something. It will be different from what someone of a different generation or a different background or a different linguistic heritage will get. But there's space for people, I think. And she sits with you in that space, and often there might be pain and laughter behind that space, and it's a sort of it's a journey you go on together. But it is, as you say, very, very readable. You're not going to be grabbing for a dictionary very often.
I actually think that the fact that you're not grabbing for a dictionary often, you're also not grabbing for a dictionary like the Urban Dictionary for the slang. And sort of a way I was going to ask, and you've answered so nicely there, like, there is such a difficulty with slang that, like you said, it has its own, I think you said this before, it has its own self-destruct button. As soon as you capture it, as soon as people are writing it down and all this sort of thing, then it moves, it changes, because that's not the point. It's, in many ways slang starts as an in-joke. It starts as something, a way friends want to refer to something. And I noticed that you have like managed to not so time date your slang that you use to represent people's speech by using things that are more recognizable to everybody, that sort of there isn't a lot of very specific slang, where I think slang is often super specific. And you sort of, so I was noticing in the sort of edits that you made to Men Don't Cry, and in the changes that you were making to Mahedzi's slang, that you were sort of, you'd moved tiny little changes from like whatever, like WOT to WHAT, and then keeping the EVVA. And he'd also moved from is it and enit, like with an E, to init with an I. And that would be sort of, you know, those are words I'm very familiar with, and obviously I am not from a community who speaks slang in such ways, and so yeah, I was wondering, like, all of that is such a fine balance to get right, and something that, you know, you've somehow managed to also, this book has to be read in America, in Australia, it has all this like readership as well. I noticed that you use, for example, kilos, and you decided to translate kilos rather than any other weight measurement, and so yeah, what a conundrum.
So, so there's two big things I think to talk about in response to that. It is really wonderful and interesting being published by Cassava Republic and knowing that we were being edited in Abuja under lockdown, and that we were thinking about readerships across Africa, and as you say, in lots of other English-speaking places. And so it was very much not tied to the British thing, and that was very liberating and really helpful that Faïza, as a French Algerian writer, was being edited by an African, a British African editor for the first time, and how that just changes even internal headspaces about the process. And in terms of the tiny changes with slang, we were talking just before we went on air, as it were, Caitlin, about how I guess I'm distilling where I'm at now in terms of just translating with, not for. And so part of that is trying to make the process porous and collaborative wherever possible. So it's not about appropriating voices, it's about giving a platform and then inviting the voices in and saying, so what do we do here? So that's literally what happened in those little changes that you saw. When I was editing the slang, we were under lockdown. Live magazine no longer exists. I'm currently, unfortunately, not in touch with Cleo Soazandri. And so I needed to think again about how I was going to invite people back into the slang, so it becomes literally the dialogue that it needs to be. And as chance would have it, I went out on a walk in Brockwell Park, which was pretty much the only kind of thing you could do under lockdown. And I ran into Rowan Ayinde. And Rowan, when we both lived on the Tulse Hill estate in Brixton, was the very young person. He was a 14-year-old who I first consulted when I was translating the slang for Golem. And he's now 30 and a spoken word artist and a poet and a photographer. And we'd kept in touch, but it was just very timely that we ran into each other. And I said, Rowan, I've got this really tricky character in Men Don't Cry. He's this really lippy, truculent, difficult, insolent boy in the classroom called Mehdi Mazouni. So exactly the character you're talking about, Caitlin. And his language has to be so on point. And, you know, I'm a granny these days. You're really going to have to help me here. Would you be up for that? And we had the most joyous session. So I'd sent him essentially Mehdi Mazouni's voice in draft version and said, have a think, read it out loud, play with it, and then let's have, as we're having today, you know, a Zoom session. And I think we were booked in for an hour and it ran to over 4 hours. And let's just play with it and let's voice it with each other and you tell me. And some of it was about the spelling, that I wasn't happy with what spelt W-O-T because it came across as patronizing, but we'd been trying something there and it didn't quite work prior to Rowan coming on board. And so we kind of acted it together. And with Barbelto, I'd done a scratch performance of the entire book with young people at Live magazine from a draft version. And they were telling me then in the moment, no, you've got to change this to that. You can't have this. We want it that way. And they're all credited in Barbelto. And of course, Rowan and Belle Parker, who I'll tell you about in a moment, the other amazing young person I work with on this, are both credited in Men Don't Cry. And so it was in acting it out and playing it and hearing the voice. And, you know, Rowan's 30, he's not 14, he never was Mehdi, but he's had a lot of insight of observing characters like Mehdi and listening to the kids in his block, and kind of how the language hasn't changed actually very much, you know, from when he was a 14-year-old. So it was sort of as if you put it, as if you offer it to actors and they play it out, and in that process you learn, you hear what sticks, what's real, what's inauthentic, what's over-egged, what's too much. And it is tiny stuff, and it's very interesting, the whole in it isn't it business, because in Discretion the children are older, they're in their 20s, and so to me it's much more on the money to have them saying isn't it in a way that an RP version might say isn't grammatically strictly correct, but it's this softening as you get older to an isn't it, as just as a set tag question. But I was being asked by editors, or don't you want to make that in it or in it? No, I don't. It's another nuance of this now. So so Rowan was a fantastic collaborator and brought amazing energy to it, and just found the humor of this character. And I think that's the thing with Faïza, it's because her characters can brush with caricature. And so what you have to find is the empathy and the humor and the thing that makes them very human. And I think that was the journey that we went on with Rowan, and that was pulling it back from being slightly caricatural. And then Belle Parker, who I also worked with, is a brilliant Arabist. She also, I reckon, has been the only Jewish halal female blonde butcher in Alexandria. I don't reckon there's been many more. So she graduated from SOAS with a brilliant degree and with a particular interest in North African Arabic. So she's, you know, Gen Y, Gen Z in a way that I'm definitely not. So when I was pulling together the draft to send to Cassava, Belle came on board as a really exciting energy and to advise me on the Arabic side of things and the nuances that we might be considering there. And she was also really helpful on the voice of Cindy, who is the wannabe celebrity on a wannabe celebrity contest show. And so I felt that in Belle and Rowan, I had these really fun sparring partners who wanted to be included in the conversation.
A core theme of Faïza's writing is family. These all are unfold with family dynamics and the way in which we all sort of fail each other, not in a way that is just universal, in a way that is just you know, the human experience moving forwards, and is particular in her case, in all her books, to what she is familiar with, to Algeria, to colonization, to this relationship between what it means to have been born in Algeria, to have grown up in Algeria, to move to France, or to be born in France, and all of these relations. But family and sort of that love, and also how we can, you know, it can hurt, and that you hurt each other within a family in a way it is almost impossible to otherwise. I was wondering how, like, that sort of theme, how you find that theme and reading about that theme and in Faïza's work.
I think it's a massive theme, and I think Faïza treated it to some extent in her I highly recommend Introduction to the Folio Society's Complete Works of Barbar. So I remember from early on Faïza talking about her kind of political consciousness, you know, coming to her, and the awareness that, in her words, it's as if France is a mother who chooses not to treat all her children in the same way. And so that idea of a family and of conflict within the family, I think, works at so many levels for Faïza, whether it's the history of colonization, whether it's the impact of bigger political forces on the microcosm that is a nuclear family, in this case, a French-Algerian family that has no other French-Algerian family living on the same soil. You know, you've got to go back to Algeria for that. And so you get all these sort of ruptures playing out, including perhaps family back in Algeria misbehaving with property that the family in France is working really hard to create for the retirement that never comes. So there's a lot of layers of family playing out in traumatic ways, and the political kind of manifesting itself in family relationships. And so I think that's exactly what you have in Men Don't Cry. You have 3 children who've been well raised, in this case in Nice in the south of France, and those 3 children have very different takes on what they want to inherit from their parents, what they think is acceptable in terms of cultural values, and what they want to continue versus what they want to run away from, put a stop to, have a massive rupture with. And so in the 3 children, you have Dunia, the eldest daughter, who decides that what she perceives to be the traditional family values are absolutely suffocating, and there's no middle way for her, and she has to go, and she has to become very secular, very careerist. She doesn't have a family, so she's sort of bucking the trend in every way, and that for her seems to be emancipation. And then you have the middle daughter, Mina, who appears to be more conventional and who gets married reasonably young to a man who's also of North African heritage and lives very close to the mother. And so there's an extended family unit, and Mina works in a care home as a carer, as does her husband. So a sort of more traditional route there. And then our protagonist and narrator is Moard, who is the youngest one and the boy, and who has qualified in the very competitive French exams as a French teacher, and is about to embark on his first job, moving up from Nice, and he's going to be teaching in a challenging school in a priority zone in a suburb outside Paris. And so he's sort of trying to bridge, in a way, the different paths that these 2 girls have taken, and all 3 of them you know, have real kind of blinding insights and real struggles, you know, within their journeys. And a family is all those things, and it's kind of making space for that. So yeah, I think the family motif is where the political meets the very personal and the very emotional and inherited baggage that we only become aware of, you know, as we become much older.
What do you think Moard has in common with Doria from Just Like Tomorrow, and with I want to say Alim from Dreams from the Ends. Am I saying that is so incredibly wrong? Achlem. And to me, Moard is a little bit of a different character. I think that he is able to be a French teacher, and you see him being a very good French teacher, really, and he's incredible, really. And I think that you would say that he is going to do a lot of good with his life. And I think that Doria and Achlem are going to as well, but they are having a harder time, not to sort of compare, but they are struggling in a way that Moard is able to leave. Do you have any sort of thoughts on that, and how that sort of functions in the French system?
So I think the thing with Moard is that he has been protected. He is the baby, and he's had a relatively secure existence, and he's had the advantage of 2 doting parents, and particularly the elder sister Dunia, who really looked out for him and helped him sort of financially and get his first pair of sneakers for secondary school and so on. And I think he's had that advantage of a relatively untraumatized childhood, although I think he probably argued that the trauma was precisely that his mother overprotected him and stultified him and made sure he didn't really develop friendships because she was terrified that he wasn't getting ahead enough and wasn't concentrating on his exams hard enough, and that the other kids had it much easier. So there's some funny scenes around that with the mother, but he emerges reasonably unscathed. And I think in a sense the journey with Moard is about self-awareness and sort of little by little navigating how these different strands of France that he's encountering, how they coexist. So dramatically in Men Don't Cry, he stays with his cousin Miloud in Paris, and Miloud was always a ne'er-do-well from Algeria who's done time in jail. And suddenly Miloud is shacked up with a sugar mummy, with a very, very wealthy ex-diplomat's ex-wife. And is living the life in the 16th arrondissement, so the equivalent of Knightsbridge in London, and very chic arrondissement of Paris. And Moard is kind of rattling around these different worlds, from his school back in Nice, the hospital where his dad is having to stay, and then France, moving up to Paris, where the demographics and the geographical areas are very divided, and there's this blinding contrast between the 16th arrondissement where he's staying and gets to borrow a posh car, and the suburb where he's teaching that's labeled a priority zone for education, so a sort of a troubled spot. And of course his memories of Algeria and their holidays back there, and he's trying to make sense of all of that. And what I find very striking about Moard is his assuredness. I think his political consciousness and his intellectual ability to interrogate is what saves him. And we know that he's a big reader, that he spent most of his summers escaping his mother by sitting up on a disused umpire's chair from a tennis court that his dad, who's a hoarder of rubbish, has lobbed into the junkyard that is their back garden. And he'd sit up there with his citronade and the book and some kind of head protection and just read his way through the summer. And that kind of intellectual rigor that he has means that when he finally lands at an incredibly posh diplomatic reception for a Scandinavian minister for integration, he's completely able to hold his own, and he's completely unfazed by the bigwigs there and the entitled way in which they're lauding their opinions about. And he very quickly scrutinizes who's there, where they're coming from, and that he's not going to listen to stuff in silence. So I think he benefits from not having been a direct component in trauma himself. And therefore he's in a position to be able to help kids like Mehdi Mazouni, who have a much more problematic upbringing. I think by contrast, what hits Doria in Just Like Tomorrow and Achlem in Dreams from the Ends is that a lot is asked of them very early in their lives. And Doria's father walks out, taking with him his pension from the Renault factory where he's worked all his life, and he's off back to Morocco in that case to sire the son, the Mohammed, that he hasn't managed to have in an emasculating existence in France. And so Dunia finds herself as a very young teenager, Doria, sorry, without a dad, with no money, with a mum who's depressed by the situation and who has been overprotected by the husband working, and suddenly, having raised a child to the age of 13, not speaking French well, is suddenly going to have to begin to integrate in a way she never has. So those are really tough adult themes that Doria's having to contend with, and her killer weapon in response to that is humor. She's just got the most cracking sense of humor, and she's very beguiling and very lovable, but quite unself-aware. And so So we follow her on that summer of coming of age and perhaps falling in love and greater self-awareness. And with Ahlem, it's truly traumatic because the mother has been murdered in a village assassination at a wedding in Algeria's Black Decade by Islamic terrorists. So Ahlem has had to bring her little brother Foued over to France to join with the dad there, and she's in loco parentis. So she's lost her mum, she's having to be a mum, she's having to raise this child, and she's having to sort of hop between her world outside the périphérique, so the ring road that circles Paris, and then into this other world in Paris where she holds down jobs. It's much closer to a film, a fantastic film that I saw this week called Rocks. That is a collaborative film made with a fantastic group of young women from the East End of London. And it follows them as teenagers. It's a fiction and it's directed by Sarah Gavron, who made Suffragette and Brick Lane. But it's very much a collaborative film. It's very much a with, not for. And the central story there is a young British Nigerian girl whose mother has mental health issues and cannot cope with raising the kids and walks out one morning. And the British Nigerian girl has to look after her brother and is terrified of social services getting them. And it's about how long she can hold out, kind of holding it together before they do. And I think that Dreams from the Ends has a very similar motor driving it. Yeah.
I think the sort of unspoken link there also feels like gender. I think that, and that also that would sort of correlate with Maru. I forgot. Sorry, that name's escaped me now.
Tell me character.
From Men Don't Cry, the main character, the narrator.
Moard. Yeah.
That his actually in some ways his sisters have had rougher times than him, and I think that Faïza's books really explore gender in a way, in sort of the expectations that women and young girls have put on them, and how difficult to sort of understate that can be, and navigating those expectations of both of everyone really, and how everyone's expectations need and require something different from them.
Yeah, I think the gender thing is huge for Faïza, and that the women have to constantly adapt and reinvent and assume responsibility, and that in a way Moard is a kind of a lucky example, because he comes good and becomes this accomplished teacher, but he's lucked out in that he's had an easier ride. Yeah, so I think there are questions as well as to the extent to which integration is gendered. And again, you know, that Moard is more exceptional in that sense, because I think statistical and personal experience around Faïza will probably point to it being much harder for the men to integrate. But that doesn't detract from the very tough journeys that the women go on and that they make work.
So to sort of wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to say about the use of language and slang in particular? And sort of, you mentioned the backwards words, and sort of, I guess maybe I'd like to ask about like French slang and sort of the slang in the original. Sort of, is there anything that stands out to you? I mean, there's lots of things that stand out about that, but sort of a final word on that, as it were.
I think the thing with the slang is that it was as surprising for metropolitan French readers to discover that on the page as it was for us to discover it in translation in the English. Just the fact of putting it down on paper was a new thing. And the fact that Faïza was so judicious with her dosage that it was not a photocopy of how people speak. And it was there, I often say, as a bridge, not a fence, you know, and so you had grannies in National Front areas reading Just Like Tomorrow and loving it for being a love story. And you had boys who called themselves book virgins on troubled estates with very low slung jeans reading it. And saying, you know, this is the first time I've read a book through to the end, and they're finding a way in on it. And I think Faïza succeeds in that because she's ensuring that there is enough of the capture of that slang and texture for it to invite people from all different walks and talks in, but there's not so much that it starts excluding different categories. Of course, you might come in with some prior knowledge, and that might mean you know a bit more about this, but you're not excluding people. And I think that's the big driver with the language for her. It's always about including and making visible and getting voices heard and sharing them and situating them on the map, and not having them lurking in a shadow or demoted in some sort of hierarchical system.
Absolutely. And that sounds like a perfect message on which to sort of take into our lives. Thank you so much, Sarah. I can't thank you. And thank you for all the work that you do translating Faïza and all the other authors you translate. It's really fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me, Caitlin, and thank you for being such an enthusiastic reader. I think it's joy when you start an interview and you're told, wow, I've just finished it and this is what I think. That's such a fantastic energy to come in on. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing Men Don't Cry come out this summer, and I hope that's going to be of interest for your festival readers and listeners, and very good luck with the rest of the festival.
Thank you. I can very highly recommend it if anyone looks, and Casper in general would very highly recommend Casper. So thank you very much for watching. If you would like to see any more events from the festival, it's all sort of down below in, you know, where the description box and there's Zoom link. Not the Zoom link, the YouTube link, and everything will be listed down below. We do have a Patreon if you are able to donate anything towards the costs of running the festival. And thank you so much, and we shall see you all soon. Bye.
Ta-ra.